So the name of the second talk is Movements from Islam to Christ, with a focus on Iran. One of the questions I get quite often when I'm being interviewed for a website or a journal or a magazine or newspaper about my research is, what is the most surprising thing that you found? What's the most surprising thing that you found? And my answer is always the same, and it is that this is happening at all. It is surprising. There's a verse in Habakkuk, many of you who preach have probably preached from it, that where the Lord is telling his prophet, I'm going to do something. It's something that even if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. Now, in Habakkuk, that's that the Chaldeans are going to come and destroy Jerusalem, right? Not great news. But I think about that verse. I think about that verse when I look at what is going on today. So I want to go a little bit into the historical roots of what's going on in terms of Muslims coming to Christ, why this is happening, and a couple of examples from different parts of the world. I think a lot of you have experience dealing with Arabs, with Iranians, with Turks. One of the advantages of doing this sort of research is that you kind of get to step back. You have to step back and you have to look at a bunch of different movements and find out what the commonalities are, but also how different movements are unique. So that's what we're going to do right now. Well, first of all, there have always been individual conversions here and there, but what we're talking about now are movements. This is kind of like the difference between Jan Hus and Martin Luther. Jan Hus and Martin Luther theologically very close to each other, but Jan Hus didn't start a movement, and Martin did. Why did Brother Martin, that devout Augustinian monk, how did he start a movement? What was the difference between him and Jan?
Well, I don't think the difference was the two persons. I think it was the circumstances around them.
And what was the main circumstantial difference?
The press.
That's it, the printing press, right?
It also has support by the government.
Mm-hmm. And he had political support too, right? These are profoundly biblical things, a printing press and political support, right? Yes?
Plus, there was a whole atmosphere of a need for change.
A need for change. There was that sense that the way we're doing things, there's something not quite right about this. Yeah. So all of those things, we were going to find similar analogs in terms of what's going on today. Although that analogy of the Protestant Reformation is much weaker than the one from the early church. I think that returning to our patristic roots, we can find a lot of strategies, a lot of ways of thinking and speaking that can really nourish the church's mission to Islam and to Muslims today. Maybe that's for the next book. I don't know. So when does this start? When do we start seeing movements? Well, the first one that I've been able to find is in Indonesia. This is in the 1960s and the 1970s. By the way, I have put my business cards on that table at the entrance, so please grab one of those. All these articles I'm mentioning, instead of printing tons of stuff and bringing it from Spain, not a great idea, I prefer to email all that to you. There is a global census that I worked on with someone named Patrick Johnstone. If any of you have heard of Operation World, he is the driving force behind Operation World for many editions. And Patrick and I worked together on putting together a global census of believers from a Muslim background. And it was for the year 2012, but we went country by country throughout the entire world. And based on the best information we could find, we estimated how many believers from a Muslim background were in each and every country. Some of them we underestimate a little bit. Some of them, Saudi Arabia, we overestimated way too much. But it's the first and the only project like that to ever have been done. Also, all of my own articles, you can access them through academia.edu. Indonesia. So in Indonesia, we have, an estimate is 2 million Muslims. The book on this is called Indonesian Revival, 1977, by Avery T. Willis. He was a Southern Baptist missionary who then did either a thesis for a master's or a PhD, I don't remember which. And the book is the fruit of that. And it's very fascinating because he, unlike a lot of Baptist scholars, is willing to see that there are all of these non-religious, non-spiritual things going on behind the scenes. Kind of like with the Reformation, which is why I offer that as an example. There's all of this contextual stuff with the Reformation that has nothing to do with religion, but if it was not in place, nothing would have happened, like with Jan Hus. So what's going on in Indonesia? This is happening in the 1960s and the 1970s. A lot of people would like to think, well, there was some great theological breakthrough related to Missio Dei or related to who knows what, and we had a new missiological method, and so we were able to convert all the Muslims. No, that is not what happened in Indonesia. There was political strife between Orthodox Muslims who were concentrated in the urban areas and between communists. There was an attempted coup. That was in 1965. The communist coup was suppressed. And then after that, the Orthodox Muslims said we have to organize the society correctly, which means that we have to classify everyone's religion. We have to classify everyone's religion. That is a key aspect of Sharia. You need to be able to do that. Now, in many of the villages in the mountains, the Muslims there were not informed by Orthodox Sunni teachings. Indeed, they were what we would call syncretistic. They had really combined a lot of pagan animistic elements with Islam into something that the Orthodox Muslims looked at and said, that is not Islam. You guys are bad Muslims. You need to be good Muslims. Prior to that, when there was no classification of religion, it didn't really matter because you didn't have to choose your religion. During this time, because they are forced to choose a religion and they are simultaneously being told that they're lousy Muslims, some of them start looking around and say, well, if we're lousy Muslims and we can't continue being Muslims like we are, which we've been for many centuries, what are the other options? And some of them started looking at Christianity. They were forced to choose a religion that they could have on their IDs. If that had not happened because of the conflict between the Muslims and the communists, they would never have started going to a lot of these Christian churches. I think a lot of them come from the Reformed tradition, from the Dutch Reformed tradition. But by this time, they're mostly indigenous. That is, they're running their own show. They're not being run by missionaries to a great degree anymore. So you have entire families coming to clergy and saying, well, we have to choose a religion. We don't like this whole Sunni Islam that they're practicing because they say that we're not doing it right. So since we have to choose something, this whole extended family, we've decided to become Christians. They don't know anything about Christianity, okay? I mean, they might have heard a couple of stories. They might have known a Christian neighbor, like, oh, he's a good guy. But they don't know the theology. So you have these clergy, these pastors, who are put in a challenging but providential situation. And so these people have decided to sign up for Christianity so they can have that name on their ID or whatever. And they're teaching them. And then through this process of teaching them, this catechism prior to baptism, some of them actually are starting to believe. So this is where we have, and the whole story, of course, I've given you the book. You can look in, it's very surprising, but that book is quite a good book. But in a nutshell, that is a key thing that's going on. So what's the takeaway from that? Political change can result in religious conversion. Political change can result in religious conversion. And I think, from based on what I've talked with you all about, I think some of you are seeing that. And we'll get more to that with Iran. Let me talk about a movement in northern Africa. So this is in Algeria.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Before you move on from Indonesia, can I just ask what happened to those converts? Are they still part of a Christian minority in Indonesia?
Yes, they are.
Wow.
They are.
Good to hear. What do you have this mechanism? Do you have a word for this movement? I mean, we have been talking like prior to this about the pull or push conversion.
Yeah, pull or push. So here, and we will talk about that more. So conversion is a turning away from and a turning to something.
Yeah.
Sometimes, but here what you have is you have a push.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have this thing that is not religious at all, the obligation to sign up as a religion, but then you also have this push from the Orthodox Sunnis who are better educated in the urban area saying, you're lousy Muslims. You're not doing it right. the way you guys have been doing Islam for 1,000 years is wrong. So that is a push. Okay. Yes.
Well, I think it was a period of so much struggle, so many atrocities, that I think that also played a part.
And that's part of the pull.
Those atrocities, saying we don't want to be part of that.
Yeah, and that's part of the pull, right? Seeing how, and there are massacres going on during this time, and Willis covers that quite well. But the way that Christians responded to a really violent situation, that attracted some people. So you have both of these things going on. In conversion from Islam to Christianity, you almost always have both of these elements working together. Conversion means turning. So it always means turning away from something and not only turning to something. It's always turning away from Islam to Christianity. Now, it can start more with the pull or the push, but in my experience, you're almost always going to find both of those things working together. Good. So Algeria. In Algeria, we go in maybe 1990 from a couple dozen believers to today tens of thousands. These numbers are very difficult to figure out with precision because these are almost always persecuted minorities. There are many motives to exaggerate the number. If you're a missionary raising funding, the more the better. On the other hand, there are also motives to minimize the number. If you're an indigenous Christian in Algeria and you want to make sure that no one is worried about you and that they're going to just leave you alone, then you want to say, oh, we're just very few. We're very few, you know. So there are always motives to maximize or minimize the numbers. So that's why I have these big ranges. So in Algeria, 20 to 60, maybe 80,000 today. Well, what is going on with Algeria? Well, first of all, there is an ethnic element to what is happening in Algeria. Who are the really ancient people of Algeria, of North Africa? What are these people usually called?
Berber.
Yeah, Berbers, right? Where does that word Berber come from?
The barbarian.
Yeah, it is barbarian. It's just a different way of saying the same word. Where does that word come from?
I think it comes from the Greek, who couldn't understand what they said.
Right, yeah, so I don't know what you say in Danish, but in English, blah, 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 like, I don't know what it is. So bar, because they didn't speak a civilized language, which is basically Greek and Latin, right? So these Berbers, we usually call them by their self-given name, the Amazi, today, although most of them don't mind using the word Berber just because it's internationally known. These Berbers are really the ancient people of North Africa, and they have become used to just these flows of people coming in. You had the Phoenicians coming in and establishing Carthage, and you had the Romans coming in, and you had the Vandals coming in, and then you had the Arabs coming in, and so they're used to this idea of these people always kind of coming in. The difference is that they were usually in a mountainous people, and the visitors usually settled in the coastal areas. There are some exceptions, but by and large, they tended to stay to themselves. But the thing is, when the Arabs came in, they gradually were forced into a cultural process of Arabization. In Christianity, there's no one normative culture. Sometimes we act like there is, okay, or sometimes we think there is, even though there's not one. But there is no normative culture in Christianity. In Islam, there is. I mean, the Sharia is all based around a particular man living a particular life in the 7th century in Arabia. And the Sunnah is the answer to the question, how do I live a happy or successful life? You imitate the Prophet. You wear sandals like he did. You wear a distaff like he did. You comb your hair like you even brush his teeth like he did. All of these things. This is how you know the ideal pattern for life. So Christians might have what would Jesus do, but that's like ethical, right? How to treat your neighbor. But what would Muhammad do? It is about all that stuff, you know, how to eat a melon. There's a famous saying from you guys know this story? No? Yeah, there's a famous Islamic jurist, and his students came to him and said, oh, we have some melons, they're beautiful, would you like to eat melon? He said, I do not eat melon. And he said, why would you not eat melon? Everyone loves melon. And he said, well, we have no hadith telling us how the Prophet ate melon, so I would not want to do it the wrong way. Now, it's a funny story, but it illustrates a point that to Christians is weird. So, I was going somewhere with this. Yeah, Arabization. There we go. So the Arabs continue to tell the Amazigh or the Berbers, you have to speak Arabic. Don't speak your language. You need to use Arab names. These are the good Islamic names. Don't use your old Berber names. This is not okay. You need to pray in Arabic. Don't even think about praying in your barbarian language. That's not the divine language of the Quran. So there is this Arabization. We have something interesting that happens. One of the main breakthroughs, and this is also true for Turkey, by the way. One of the main breakthroughs is when you have the New Testament translated into their indigenous language. You also have a brethren missionary who spends an entire missionary career, and I think we would say, if we were there at the end of his career, you haven't really done anything. Okay, but he had, because his daughter had learned Berber, the Berber dialect of that part of northern Africa fluently. And she would go ahead and do radio broadcasts, old technology. And then here are these Berbers hearing this person who they don't see her, but they just assume obviously she's one of them because she grew up speaking the language and spoke it just like they did. And so what happened? It was this validation of their language, this validation of their culture, that to many of them said, yes, this is good. The God of Christianity loves and accepts us in our own linguistic and ethnic particularity.
Amen.
He doesn't want to force us to become Arab, which is, again, how many of them experienced Islam. And there are reasons for that. There are good reasons for them having experienced Islam like that, and it goes back to the Sharia and the idea of patterning life after one Arab man in the 7th century, and that being the divinely revealed template for how all humans at all times should live. So that is Algeria. So what's the takeaway from that? Translation is a strength. Yes?
Just briefly regarding the language imposed by Islam. The whole thing is that since God's word to Muhammad was revealed in Arabic, and thus the book of God, the Quran, is written in Arabic. Everybody should learn Arabic in order to read the book, and that's why it's not commonly accepted that to translate the Quran into other languages than Arabic.
Yes.
I think that would be a great breakthrough if it was generally accepted that you translate the Quran into your own native language. That would break the somewhat medieval connection.
That's okay. Let me tell you about that. I wasn't going to tell you the story, but I'm going to tell it to you now. So, Muslims are very, very smart, of course, some of them, and they look at what Protestant missionaries are doing and say, we can do this. We can do the same thing. So what is the Muslim Brotherhood, that whole pattern of kind of organizing a society? What is that based on? YMCA. Okay? The Muslims saw what the Christians were doing in Egypt and were like, we can do that too. So they did it. So Muslim Brotherhood, more successful today than the YMCA probably. Right? More international and on many more college campuses than the YMCA is, I will tell you. And a lot more influence in terms of international politics as well.
But they don't have a song from the village.
No, they don't have a song from the village people. And the swimming pools, right? We need the swimming pools. Well, the government of Saudi Arabia saw that Christians were being so successful because we were translating the Bible into all these languages. I don't know if you know this, but the main force in the world today that is keeping fragile or at-risk languages alive, it's Christian missions. It is the main thing in the world today that is keeping languages alive. And Saudi, the royal house of Saud, someone there saw that. And they said, what we need to do is we need to sponsor translations of the Quran into all of these international languages. The translations have a lot to be wanting. I mean, they're really flawed and really biased in many ways if you read the English translation and so on. But like when I was living in Israel, they announced that, hey, we have a new translation of the Quran into modern Hebrew, right? So it's there, and one of the largest printing presses, maybe the largest printing press in the world, is the one that prints all of these translations of the Quran in the city of Medina. So they saw that, but then what's going on? Some Muslims, when they read the Quran, before it was all this Arabic, they knew how to pronounce the letters and sound it out, but it would be like you or I reading something in Latin. Maybe we know the pronunciation, but we don't know it well other than a couple of words. But then they read it, and some of them, not all of them, were really startled by what they found there and said, wow, this is not what I thought it was. I'm not sure that I really like this. So that can be part of that push that goes into conversion. But you are right, theologically speaking, it is impossible to translate the Quran. So when my friends tell me, why don't you become a Muslim? I say, I'm not Arab. And they say, well, you don't have to be Arab. Islam is for all the world. And I said, no, you have this book. It's only in Arabic. And even though I speak Arabic well and can read it, I'm not an Arab. I speak English. That's my first language. So I like the Bible. The Bible was revealed in these languages, but the Bible can be translated into all these wonderful languages. Whereas this book is just an Arab book. And so it's really a book for the Arabs, isn't it? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I've never thought about it that way. Yes.
Yeah, it makes sense. But you said that I've lived in Israel myself and worked in Palestine among MBBs, and some of them don't want to be called Christians because they feel like Christianity has a cultural note to it. Like the word, and but you said that Christianity doesn't bring a culture to it or with it, but they feel that maybe you know about Marshall Louis from he says that why do I have to vote for George Bush? Why do I have to vote for democracy?
Yeah. Well, my answer to that would be that is a simplification. It is sloppy thinking regarding the nature of Christianity. If people don't understand what Christianity means, what the word Christian means, then I don't want to just say, well, let's just throw out the word, which is basically what that point of view does. I want to say, well, let's go ahead and work on mining the biblical and the historical resources so we can come up with a real meaning of Christian. Because you're right, like the Arab Christians, they'll always make these special little cookies during Easter, and like that's not maybe what makes you a Christian. But then if you're not a Christian, then what are you? So Algeria. Now let's go ahead and move on to Iran. But the takeaway from Algeria is that translation is a strength. So what happens in Iran? Iranian Christians represent one of the most quickly growing Christian communities in the world today. What happened with Islam in Iran? Well, 1979, the Islamic Revolution. Islam, remember how I was giving you the parallel between communism and Sharia, right? Well, Iran has been kind of unique in that they have been able to live the dream. They had the Ayatollah from his villa in Paris, thank you, I guess Paris, sending, there's that new technology. How was he sending all of his sermons to Iran back in the late 70s and in the mid-70s? Cassette tapes, right? There's that technology again. He was sending all these cassette tapes, and he was making promises. He was going to say, we're going to make Persia great again. You're going to love it, believe me. He was going to say, it's going to be better for women, right? Because Islam cherishes women. We don't make our women into whores and prostitutes like the West does and like the Shah wants to do. We respect our women. We guard their virtue and their chastity. So Islam and the Islamic State or Islamic government is going to be better for women. It's also going to be better, all you communists who are in Iran, because that was a thing back then, you're going to love it. Because Islam is not about enriching or giving wealth to the ruling class who own all the resources and taking stuff from the worker and keeping the worker down, but Islam cares about the rights of the worker in relation to the owner and so on and so forth. So the communists, you're going to love it too. Religious minorities, you're going to love it because Islam has a way of being tolerant to you and treating you with respect as dhimme. That is totally not true. But these were the promises, and people bought it, and he was successful. So in 1979, the Shah leaves, he arrives there, and he takes control. Well, what do people find? A lot of women end up being very estranged from Islam because the university system has changed and a lot of careers that were open to women are closed. Okay? A lot of the communist and secular Muslims are likewise not happy. Economically, what happens with Iran? Does Iran demonstrate that Islam creates a wonderful economic power, an economically powerful, growing society? What happens? No.
War with Iraq and
But they are still rich. They are still rich.
but the money is with the mullahs. So
Well, the Revolutionary Guard. You want to know who's controlling the economy of Iran? It's the Revolutionary Guard to a large degree. And then you also have this war, the war between Iraq and Iran. So when we look at some of the early converts, a lot of them will mention this. They'll say, so here we were, and sending even sometimes little children off to wage jihad of one Muslim country against another Muslim country. And we're being told that this is jihad. Muslim killing Muslim. And some people bought it because you have the Sunni Shia divide there. But for a lot of Muslims, that was very problematic. They looked at the Sunni Muslims like, well, they have a different way of being Muslims than we do, but that doesn't mean that they're apostates that need to be killed, does it? And Iraq, some of the Iraqis also had a similar reaction, but especially among Iranians. Because the difference, of course, is that Saddam Hussein was not claiming to be, a Sharia state, even though elements of that were in the law. But Iran was. The other thing is that Iran is just this country that has an amazing history, which we know from the parts of it from the Bible, actually, and in terms of natural resources, very wealthy. This is not a country like Algeria or Jordan, where you're like, what is this, like 5% arable land and mostly desert? I mean, this is a country that if there's one country that was really going to be able to show the world the glory of an Islamic Sharia state, it was going to be Iran. And as we know, it was just very unsuccessful. So what happened in Iran? Well, Islam has two sides. There's a great quote from the Ayatollah Khomeini. He said, Islam is politics or it's not Islam. I love that. It's so clear, so concise. Islam is politics or it's not Islam. And because the political promises of Islam failed, because the two things cannot be disentangled, a lot of Muslims became disillusioned with the spiritual aspects of Islam as well. They said, well, if the political side doesn't work, then the spiritual side must also be problematic. It must also not work. You also had, and so there's that push, that disappointment with Islam, which we'll talk about more after lunch. You also have some visionary leadership. There is an Armenian bishop of the Assemblies of God. I don't know if the Assemblies of God is very present in Denmark, is it? No? In the United States, it's one of the most successful, quickly growing churches for those who think, oh, Christianity is in decline. In the middle of the 1970s, the Episcopal Church, which has gone the liberal way, since 1975 or so, it's lost about 50% of its membership. The Assemblies of God, since the 1970s, which has a high standard for membership, for involvement, and theologically fairly conservative, has quintupled in size. Okay, so there's another sociology of religious...
5 times.
5 times, yes. Quintupled, yes. Sorry, this is... I write stuff for Oxford, and they're like, Dr. Miller, we like this, but this is very advanced vocabulary. I'm like, you're Oxford. You're the ones with the dictionary. I mean, read your own dictionary. It's in there. Mediatorially.
We need help.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about that. So you have this visionary leadership from Haakon Sepien. So what the Iranian government had been doing was saying, okay, we have these little Christian communities, the Assyrians and the Armenians, but we are going to kind of make sure that the Christian message cannot spread to them, from them to the larger Persian population. And how are they doing that?
Well, it's not possible to make worship in Farsi.
That's it. They would say, you can have complete freedom of religion, you can have your Bibles, you can have your books in Armenian and Syriac. But Haakon Sepien he's a real bishop. He's a great bishop. And he says, I know what we need to do. We are never going to reach the larger Persian community if we don't start worshiping in Farsi. So he starts doing this. He starts worshiping in Farsi. There's a great movie about him, and you actually get to hear him celebrating communion in Farsi with the translation. And he's martyred. He's a martyr bishop. So, like Cyprian of Carthage, like that. We are going back to those days. So, Hakov Sepian, he also, his influence spreads beyond the Assemblies of God tradition into other Protestant churches because there is a board of churches and he serves as the president of that board. So other people from other churches start to listen to this idea and start to hear about what's going on in Muslims coming to Christ. And a lot of them are afraid, but some of them say, yes, we're going to do this. So you have the disappointment with Islam. You have visionary leadership that leads to worship in Farsi. There's that language element again, which we saw in Algerian. And then you have another key element, which is that technological side again. You have the erosion of the ability of the state to contain the spread of the Christian message. Again, you have the erosion of the ability of the state to contain the spread of the Christian message. And here I'm talking about satellite TV and more recently the internet. This is a sword that cuts both ways though, because traditionally, if you had a young Muslim in Copenhagen 30 years ago and he went to the one mosque in town and he thought, this imam is not really teaching me true hardcore Islam. I want to find some other teacher who's going to really instruct me in the ways of Allah. He really didn't have anywhere to go. I mean, there was that one mosque and that was that, you know. But now, if he feels like that, and a lot of people do feel like that, then they've got plenty of access to all sorts of visions of Islam, many of which are quite militant and quite unsettling, really, for many non-Muslims. And he has access to that. So you had one of the great teachers of Al-Qaeda, Anwar al-Awlaki, who's an American citizen but teaching from Yemen, but his teachings saturated large segments of Muslim communities in Europe and in the United States and Canada as well. So that globalization of information, I'm just saying that goes both ways. So the increase in Islamic violent Islam and the increase in conversions from Islam to Christianity in some ways feed on some of the same technological developments in terms of communication and globalization in terms of travel. So what's the takeaway from Iran? Well, I've already given you a couple of points, but I think one of the key ones is that Islam's greatest strength can also be its greatest weakness. Islam has a certain way of enforcing conformity that religion in the West has not had for many centuries. But that idea of enforcing conformity is not for people who are open to different options and who are open now to different avenues of ways of knowing God, whereas before they did not have that option to know about those ways. That enforcing conformity is becoming less and less attractive in many ways. I'll give you an example as I close this up. I was talking with an Iranian pastor in the United States, and he was the associate pastor of an Iranian church. It wasn't a particularly big one, but most Iranian churches are not very big, maybe 20 to 30 people on a Sunday morning. And he said that he was talking with his niece, I think, in Iran, who is not a Christian, okay, but she's an Iranian. And they were chattering in Farsi, and then he said, as most Muslims will say in Arabic, Inshallah. And his own niece said, don't talk to me in Arabic. You say that in Farsi. Be'omeda Khoda. You say that in Farsi. What was she trying to do? She's trying to affirm her linguistic and ethnic uniqueness. Another convert that I got to interview, and this was a young lady, she must have been 19 at the time. She said, and this is, kind of strong polemics here. She said, well, for the Arabs, Islam was a step up, because before that they were just a bunch of illiterate warring tribes with no science or knowledge, which kind of an overgeneralization, but not totally incorrect. But for the Persians, Islam was a step down. What is she doing? She is giving a theological interpretation to history. Okay. For the Arabs, yes, I can understand why the Arabs like Islam. It united them around a common leader and a common community, so they could just stop, fighting each other, which historically is actually true. There was a lot of tribal warfare or tribal fighting between the Arabs prior to, and then after Islam. The first thing that happens after Muhammad dies is the wars of apostasy, right? This is the main thing that Abu Bakr, the caliph, has to handle as soon as Muhammad dies, is all these tribes in Arabia are like, well, now that the main guy's dead, we're going to go back to paganism. So he has to go and to remind them with the sword that they are Muslims and that they can't just leave this thing just because Muhammad died. So anyway, here, these are just a couple of different examples of movements. There are plenty of other ones that we could talk about, but I did choose these ones to mention specifically. Indonesia, Algeria, and Iran. Overall, we can offer 3 categories, and I go into this in quite some detail in Living Among the Breakage if you want more information and lots of footnotes and stuff. 3 categories of factors that have not caused the surge in conversions, but that have facilitated it. That is, that have made this possible. And these 3 categories are, first of all, transcendent. And when we talk about dreams and visions and miraculous answers to prayer, or some people would say, well, it was just God's time. I asked a whole bunch of missionaries and ministers working with Muslims, why is this going on now? It is God's time, okay? Answered prayer. These are the transcendent elements. The second category of factors is globalization. So the flattening of the world. I don't know if that book was very common here, The Earth is Flat or The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. And just talking about how easy it is to communicate and to travel. All of that has also made this possible in a way that it was not. When we talk about satellite, when we talk about radio, that is all part of that globalization process. And the third category is missiological. There have been some key shifts in terms of how Christians from the West, and now increasingly from places like India, from sub-Saharan Africa, from South Korea, are thinking about mission, what the church looks like as it engages in mission that is culturally sensitive, that is contextual. So that is a third category of things. But I would say that of those 3 categories, the missiological one, as much as a missiologist I hate to admit it, is probably the least important of those 3. Okay, so we can do some questions and answers. I think we've got about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll have lunch.
But doesn't the globalization go 2 ways?
Mm-hmm.
Islam is expanding through globalization as well, the translation of Quran and the internet and the access to all the resources online. It has a 2-way.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of Muslim leaders are very cognizant of this. I mean, they look at Europe today and they'll say it publicly, and they'll just, even politicians and stuff, they'll just say, this is great. We tried for centuries to overtake Europe by the sword and we failed. But now we're just going to get Europe just by migrating and having more babies. I mean, they'll say stuff like this. I'm sure that you all have heard these statements. And then Henry.
I was just reflecting on, one of the key debates that we have in Europe is what we call the integration debate. Migrants coming to Europe and challenging our European identity. Now, coming with an Islamic view, you have this, as you said, a more static view of culture, which you bring with you, and you put that over against the incarnational view in Christianity. How would you frame that in public discourse? How would you bring that theological perspective into the public integration debate, or would you at all?
Yeah, integration. This is always, I think this is like the messianic figure of secular people, including a lot of secular Christians. They're like, integration will save us. Integration saves. Well, the first question that I asked, I've been asked this question so many times, but it's a great question, thank you for mentioning it, is you've got to ask, integrate into what? Integrate into what?
Democracy. how the secularists would answer.
Mm-hmm. And then you have to ask the second question. Why would they want to integrate into that? What is it about Danish culture that is better than Turkish culture? Can you say that? Why would they want to integrate into Danish culture? And how can you have a discourse of integration without having an axiological discussion? Axiological, the branch of philosophy that studies values. Are parts of Danish culture better than parts of Moroccan culture?
But that's not...
Maybe, but you can't say it. Can you? Can you say that here?
Yeah, we say it.
I mean, that's not the Danish reality. The Danish reality is not a question of we should ask which culture is the best. They have come here as strangers. They need to integrate into what is the
Why?
Danish. No, that's not the question. That's not asked. I mean, we can ask it as Christians, but the Danish population don't ask this question. And
What if they don't want to?
politicians,
What if they don't want to?
They should, otherwise the hostility will raise, and that's our political situation.
But they don't want to, and they don't want to leave. Then what?
Keep them out. That's what we do.
That would be a violation of their. That would be a violation of their human rights.
Yes, but
Yes.
this is the
Only if they have
political
citizens.
atmosphere right now in Denmark. This is the political atmosphere. This
No, I'm totally aware of these, and I'm not trying to make light of these issues, but I'm just saying that there are all these questions underneath the integration discussion. They're much harder questions, and at the heart of it, you have to be able to answer the question, why is this culture, or this aspect of this culture, better than this aspect of this culture? Why is the way that Danish culture treats women better than the way that Arab culture treats women? Our human rights come from God. We believe in Islam, by the way, that doctrine of universal human rights is not present in Islam. In Christianity, and even in Western legal tradition, it is because we were made in the image and likeness of God that each and every human being has certain inalienable rights. It comes from Genesis 1, I think 27 and 28. And if you get rid of Genesis 1, 27 and 28, then human rights are simply the matter of a society or a court. And if they're a matter of a society or a court, then they're not inalienable because societies and courts change their minds all the time. So I would enunciate that. Human rights are inextricably related to Christianity. And if Europe wants to get rid of Christianity in the public space and in moral dialogue in relation to law, you will not have human rights here.
But we ask another question to immigrants and to refugees. We ask of them to be part of the culture that we don't even agree about, and it's actually more divided than we want it to be.
And that is related to the question I had asked before. Integrate into what? Okay, it's easy to say the word integration or assimilation or whatever, but integrate into what? What is there today a common vision of who Danes are and what it means to be Danish? And it's a question. I know in the United States there's not, but it's a much bigger country with a lot of different history. But in a small country, sorry, is it small? I don't know if you consider Denmark small. I'm from Texas. Texas is big. In a medium-sized country like Denmark. So, okay, we'll go there and then here, and then we'll break for lunch.
I'm sorry, I just personally want to leave the, can you say, the political society debate about integration.
Yeah, one final point on that though.
Okay.
I think the gift of the church is that it offers a place where you can have that intelligent, that you can have that conversation intelligently. Mm-hmm. Who are Danes? What made Denmark what it is? Why is it that humans can come in and a woman from Iran who's divorced can be respected and can be welcomed? Not all of it, but a significant amount of it has to do with your Christian history.
Of course.
And you can only have that conversation in the church today, which is a sad thing. That should be a conversation that you're able to have in the public sphere. I don't know to what extent you can do that today here in the United States, which is a fairly religious country for the West. You cannot have that conversation.